happening, Deadites? Welcome back to GoreCore Reacts and Reviews. I hope you're all having an absolutely killer day. Thank you for tuning into the channel. And today, we're going to hit up something a little bit different. So today, I'm going to do a top 10 list of my favorite horror movies. And as I mentioned with the change of the name of this channel, I want to bring some different content here. So aside from doing my music reactions, I'm going to start doing movie reviews. And I want to hit up more movie trailers and maybe some other content as well. But I figured, really, why do you care about my opinion? Why do you care what movies I like? And my main reason for doing this is that basically if what I like aligns with what you like, then you're more apt to take my opinion for future movie reviews, or at least take into consideration what I'm saying. Now, if everything I list off in this video you absolutely hate, chances are we don't see eye to eye, and therefore my opinion isn't worth much. Of course, this is all subjective. We all have our own opinions. We all like movies for different reasons, so take all this with a grain of salt. Now, I had a hard time with this list, I must admit. The first few were easy enough for me, but as I got down to, number 8, 9, and 10, it started to become more difficult. There are so many great movies out there for all kinds of different reasons, but I ultimately had to pick decisions. So while the ones I picked might fluctuate a little bit over time, these are movies that I definitely love, have always loved, and will continue to love. So without further ado, let's get started. So sitting at number 10, I'm going to pick Sean S. Cunningham's Friday the 13th. Of course, this is a classic horror movie, better known as being a slasher film. Now, while in the first film, we don't really get the iconic Jason Voorhees that we're all used to in this series, this really does start everything, and I must admit that I really like the arc that falls between parts 1, 2, and 3 that leads up to Jason Voorhees being the character we're familiar with the iconic hockey mask, and I think these all play out fantastically, but I think the first one's really where everything starts, and it deserves the credit. Now, if I'm going to be honest, if I were to pick my most fun movie in the series, I would probably pick Jason Lives Part 6. I love that movie. I think it's a lot of fun. I love the supernatural elements of it. It just has a lot of iconic moments between, Jason being chained up at the bottom of the lake. We get a lake of fire. We get the Tommy Jarvis story. All that good stuff. Great imagery. I love the look of Jason in this one. Of course, he's half rotten. Again, I'm a big supernatural fan, so I like the way this all plays out. But ultimately, without the first one, none of this exists. So I'm going to pick number 1 as a classic. I love it. I love the way it's done. The typical thing we expect. We get a bunch of teenagers that are basically having sex and getting killed. So it's pretty much what you expect, but it really builds everything else up and is the beginning. I love the end of this movie. It's absolutely iconic. So just great stuff. Now, it was definitely difficult to pick this one. There are other movies I feel could have picked the number 10 slot. Like I Love They Live, which is done by John Carpenter. That easily could have picked this slot. Clive Barker's Hellraiser could have been in this spot. Now we got stuff like John Landis's American Werewolf in London. So it was a very hard pick for me, but I definitely had to go with Friday the 13th. So that's sitting at number 10. Let's move on to number 9. And in the number 9 spot, we're looking at Peter Jackson's Bad Taste. Now, some people might not really consider this a horror movie. It's definitely more of a splatter comedy, but for me, that still sits within the horror genre. So it might not be scary. I don't think there's anything about this that's too frightening, but it definitely has blood and guts and gore. There's definitely splatter to be seen. It's got horror elements. Basically, the story revolves around a group of people who are part of AIDS, which is the Astral Investigation and Defense Services that are out to eradicate these aliens who have come to Earth and are basically harvesting humans for fast food for their intergalactic fast food chain. Sounds like a lot of fun, right? It is. It was Peter Jackson's first movie. It's an independent venture. He basically raised the movie for this, on weekends, working his job, got his friends to help him out, and it was a 4-year process. It was originally supposed to be a short film that turned into a full-length film, and obviously got his career started, so it definitely paid off. I think it's a lot of fun. Now, if you're not a fan of indie films and you're more into Hollywood-style movies, this probably will not be for you. It's pretty rough, like I said, very indie, very cheap-looking, but I love the way it's done. The angles and the way it's filmed are fantastic. It's very creative, so being a fan of indie film, this one just hits all the marks for me. I think it's a ton of fun. If you've never seen it, I highly recommend you check it out. Of course, Peter Jackson is more well known for doing stuff like Lord of the Rings and big movies now, like King Kong, but in his early days, he was doing splatter films, and they're fantastic. And in spot number 8, we're looking at a remake, and typically I'm not a big fan of remakes, but the ones I do love seem to have come from the 80s, and we're looking at David Cronenberg's The Fly. I love this movie. I think it's a masterpiece. I think it's a fantastic film. I love the way it all plays out. It's very human, and then as the human becomes more of a fly and we see the degradation of that and the way he's processing his thoughts and the change within him, it just becomes more horrifying. Not to ruin anything, if you've never seen the movie, maybe turn off now because I don't want to spoil anything, but I mean, this movie's been out for years, so The ending of this movie is brilliant. I love the depressive nature of it. It's just a sad story about love that basically incorporates a monster. So being a fan of monsters and, this depressive ending, the way it all plays out is fantastic. The visuals are great. Again, all practical effects, just amazing stuff. And most of my favorite movies do fall from the 80s. I grew up in that era. I love practical effects. CGI often takes me out of horror movies, and I just think this is a great remake and one that was definitely warranted. A lot of times now you get remakes of movies that really aren't that old and aren't really much of an upgrade, and honestly, a lot of times don't play out as well. But you're talking about old movies, movies that played out in the 50s and 60s and stuff were very limited. So in the 80s, we had crazier technology, effects became better. I just think it was very suiting, and it's an absolute gem of a movie. If you've never taken the time to watch it, despite seeming like a silly movie, given it's called The Fly, it's actually a great film. Now, next on the list, sitting at number 7, I have to pick between two movies here. Now we're looking at the Nightmare on Elm Street series, and I have to admit that I have a very difficult time picking between parts 1 and part 3. Part 1 is classic. This is a Wes Craven film. He invented Freddy Krueger. It's a dark film. It's done in a more serious way. The story just works great. It all plays out nicely. Great atmosphere. I love the fact that this is based around dreams. It leaves so much to the imagination. There's so much you can do with this idea because, let's face it, you have no limits when you're dealing with dreams. And I'm actually kind of disappointed that more people haven't touched on this sort of stuff in recent years. Again, I don't want them to rip off Freddy Krueger and the Nightmare on Elm Street series, but it's just such an interesting concept. And I have to admit that I'm not really scared by movies anymore. I've been watching horror movies most of my life, but they just don't really have that impact on me. But the one thing that will give me once in a while is a crazy nightmare. I'll wake up in sweats and wonder what the hell, and it's kind of a rush, to be honest. Kind of a weird thing. I get it. You're always happy that it's over with, but at the same time, it's a hell of an experience. It's kind of like going, on a roller coaster. It's just a ride that, you really can't control. Crazy stuff. So I love the whole concept of A Nightmare on Elm Street, but I have to admit that one of the very first movies I ever saw as a kid in the horror genre was Dream Warriors, which is the third movie, which was just absolutely fantastic. It kind of brought in the more supernatural elements. It's very playful, very cool kills. We get a lot of good one-liners from Freddy in it. It's just a lot of fun. And of course, we get Nancy back, who was the final girl from the original one, so it was nice to see her come back in this one. So it's very difficult for me. There's an image in this movie that basically has been burned into my mind since I was 7 years old, and it's the character Kristen is holding this kid, and the kid's like, "Put me down, you're hurting me." And the next thing, she looks at the kid and it's a skeleton in her arms, and that has been in my head since I've been 7 years old. It is stuck with me and will be a future tattoo for me. So I love this movie, so it's very difficult for me to pick between the two. So I'm going to put them at a tie. I think most people will probably pick the original, but I do know a lot of people who like part 3 the best, but it's easily between these two. I enjoy the whole series. Some are weaker than others, but these are the two that really do it for me. Now, sitting in at number 6, and this one will probably come as no surprise, we're looking at Terrifier 2. Probably one of the few modern movies on here that has really captivated me, that I've become very enamored with. And frankly, I'm more obsessed with the Terrifier franchise right now than any other movie, even my number 1 movie, which we'll get into later. I'm nuts about these, and this might change because from everything I'm hearing about Terrifier 3, it sounds like we're in for an insane ride, so maybe it will rival part 2. And of course, I love part 1 as well. Part 2 just hits the marks a little bit more for me. It's got more of a story, more character development. The production value is just a little bit higher, but it still has that 80s vibe to it. I love the synthwave soundtrack in it. It all really just hits the marks for me. It's doing exactly what I want. The gore and blood and effects in this are just amazing. I love the practical effects. It really feels like a throwback to the 80s. And again, me being a huge fan of 80s horror, that's right up my alley. I absolutely love it. It's just great. The first one is very close. Now, it was hard to pick between the two. To me, the first one's got more of a Halloween, Friday the 13th kind of feel, whereas the second one's got more of a Dream Warriors kind of feel. Again, more supernatural elements. Some people didn't like that. I absolutely love it. So for me, it's definitely the clear winner, but both films are excellent. And like I said, part 3 might overtake both of these. I'm hearing amazing things. Can't wait to check it out on October 11th. But yeah, at the moment, Terrifier 2 sits up there. I just love everything about these movies. Typically, I don't like clowns. And I don't mean I'm scared of clowns. I just typically think they're lame. But I remember scrolling through Netflix and I saw Terrifier there, and I was like, that clown looks creepy and interesting. I watched it. I was sucked in right away, and soon after saw Terrifier 2, and immediately was hooked. I absolutely love this. I've seen it countless times. I've seen it in the theater upon its re-release. Just great stuff. It's doing exactly what I want from movies. I love directors that push limits, and that's exactly what Damien Leone is doing. So kudos to him. He's absolutely killing it. I'm happy to see somebody pushing the limits and really sticking with unrated horror movies, because it's rare these days. Everybody's out to make a quick buck, and they want to use your name to do so. So I'm getting really tired of, you know, the reboots and the sequels and everything else in between that we just really don't need. So this is refreshing in this time and age, plus it's a new horror icon. Art the Clown really is the first big horror icon I can think of that really has grabbed me in a long time. You know, to me, he sits next to Freddy, you know, Jason, Leatherface, etc., etc. So just great stuff. Now, sitting at the number 5 spot, we're going to talk about John Carpenter's The Thing. Again, another remake. But again, the time period works for me. This film is an absolute masterpiece. It's kind of funny that it's actually sitting at number 5, and I don't know if that's even fair, because this is almost the perfect horror movie. Now, I have my reasons for liking the other ones more, but just everything about this is great. I like the whole isolated feel of it. The way it's filmed is fantastic. The cast is amazing. The practical effects in this are absolutely mind-blowing. It's super gory and over the top, but at the same time, it's very engaging. I know it didn't really get very good reviews upon its release, but now it's heralded as basically being a masterpiece, which is falls in line with how I feel about it. So yeah, just everything about this works for me. Again, another downer ending that just works perfectly for me. I'm typically a fan of sad endings or downer endings. I don't want the happy, pretty ending that comes with a lot of Hollywood movies. It usually ruins it and kind of takes the realism away from it, as much as you can put realism, you know, with horror movies. Of course, a lot of stuff is very fantastical and over the top and really not realistic at all. But in this case, it just works well. So yeah, I absolutely love this film. If you've never seen it, definitely do yourself a favor and check it out. Just amazing stuff. Everything about this is great. Now at the number 4 spot, we're going to talk about Stuart Gordon's Re-Animator. This is such a fun film, and it's one that, while a lot of people do know, I mean, if you're a horror fan, certainly you've heard of Re-Animator, but it still feels like it falls a little under the radar for some people. There's so many people I know who haven't seen this movie that claim that they're big horror fans, and I'm like, how haven't you seen this movie? It's so much fun. It's so over the top. You know, we got Jeffrey Combs playing Herbert West. That's just absolutely iconic. I can't imagine anybody else in that role. He just absolutely kills it, and I think he's underrated as an actor in general. But just fantastic stuff. We get some crazy gore in this. You know, it's all practical effects once again. Just fantastic storytelling. If you're a fan of Lovecraft, this is a Lovecraft-inspired story. So Stuart Gordon really knew how to do Lovecraft right. He's done a few films. Dagon's fantastic. From Beyond's fantastic. I don't feel like many people can hit the Lovecraftian mark very well, but he was one person that could do it, and he definitely does it here. Fantastic stuff. I highly recommend you check it out if you've never seen it. It's a wild ride from start to finish. The sequels are fantastic as well. Definitely worth checking out. They weren't filmed by Stuart Gordon, but he did have some involvement. Brian Usna, who's the producer on the original film, directed the sequels. But yeah, just great stuff. The whole series is fantastic, but I think part 1 is definitely the classic entry and the must-see. So next on the list, sitting at number 3, we are looking at William Friedkin's The Exorcist. Now, this movie was out well before its time. It shocked audiences. It was nothing like anyone had seen at the time. You know, even some of the practices that were used in filming this movie probably would not be tolerated today. But the outcome is amazing. It really set the precedent for what possession films would be for the future, and that's a good thing and a bad thing. In this case, it works amazingly. The problem is that now when everybody else tries to do the same thing, I find they just kind of missed the mark. And the one thing I find especially with this is that the reason it works so well is that we have a young girl who's possessed in this. She's acting completely out of character. The obscenities coming out of her mouth are shocking because she's a young girl. She shouldn't be talking like this. But I find the sequels, they have adults doing this, and I'm sorry, but what is scary about an adult swearing? Nothing. It's not out of character. As adults, we swear all the time. It just doesn't work the same, and it starts to feel like parody. So really, the first film is the masterpiece in that sense. I am a huge fan of part 3. I think that's a sequel done right. The second is garbage. The ones after that, I don't care about whatsoever. I think they just went downhill. I haven't seen the newest one. Don't care to. I think 1 and 3 are the definitive, movies within this franchise. So if you watch both of those, that's all you need to see. Hopefully in the future we get something that's a little bit better. But again, a lot of the later stuff just feels like parody and doesn't hit the same mark. But the first one is an absolute classic. Still shocking. If you go on YouTube and you check out some reactions, you're still going to see people going, holy shit, did that just happen? It's still shocking today. Maybe not as shocking as it was back then, because I can just imagine being at the theaters when this released. I'm sure it's kind of like, the Terrifier movies now, where people were probably puking and getting upset and walking out. So great stuff, a must-see for everybody. Again, me being a big fan of supernatural stuff, this just hits the marks. I think it's great. It's very well performed. It's definitely nicely filmed. Everything about this is fantastic. Just excellent horror stuff through and through. So check it out if you've never seen it. If you haven't seen it, I'm kind of wondering, have you ever seen any horror movies before? Because, this is definitely at the top of the list. Now, in the number 2 spot for me, we are looking at Peter Jackson's Braindead, also known as Dead Alive in North America. And this movie is just so much fun. I know 2 Peter Jackson movies on the same list, which is kind of strange because I'm probably just as much of a Sam Raimi fan. But nonetheless, I picked this. This is one of the goriest movies of all time. It's so over the top. And again, maybe some people don't really consider this horror. It's definitely horror, but it's splatter comedy once again. I don't think it's particularly frightening or particularly scary, but it's definitely over the top and grotesque. The blood and guts fly throughout this movie. The whole last half hour of this movie is just blood and guts. The effects in this are absolutely amazing. I don't even know how they pulled this one off. Nothing has seemed to have been able to rival it since. So that's where my hope for Terrifier 3, based off what I've heard, I'm like, can this movie outdo Braindead? Now, the Terrifier movies are more brutal, and this is more silly, so it's a different feel for sure. But when we're just talking, pure gallons of blood flying across the screen and the insanity, Braindead takes the cake, man. I don't think anything beats it. Now, it's not for everybody. People who are into more serious horror probably aren't going to enjoy this. It's pretty goofy at times. Definitely has a lot of silly moments, a lot of one-liners, but it's so much fun. I can't imagine anyone watching this and being bored or just really not enjoying it. You might think it's stupid, but it's a lot of fun, and it's definitely one of my favorites of all time. It's a definite must for any horror movie fan. Now, as you could probably guess, and again, I'm putting it in order for these movies. This isn't really a definitive order. I have to put numbers to associate, but it is very hard to pick the order in which I like these movies. But the movie that really got me into being obsessed with horror was Sam Raimi's the original The Evil Dead. Now, when I first saw this, I hadn't seen anything quite like this before, and I was totally enamored. It blew me away. As soon as I saw it, I wanted to see it again. Of course, I wanted to see the sequels. It really started my obsession into horror. Of course, A Nightmare on Elm Street 3, Dream Warriors was the movie that I first saw, and I remember dressing up like Freddy Krueger as a kid and stuff like that, so I was definitely a horror fan at that point, but I wasn't obsessed with it. Now, look at me at 12 and 13, I see The Evil Dead. Now, horror's my thing. I became a metalhead, I became a horror fan, and those things have not stopped since, today. I'm still a huge horror metal fan, so these are things I'm passionate about. It was really the driving force of getting me into more horror stuff and checking out more. Now, I picked the original film as being my favorite, and not necessarily because it's the best film. Honestly, I think Part 2 is probably the better made film. It's probably the more creative film. It's the more unique film, but it's less scary. The first one's really what started everything. 2 is almost kind of like a remake of the first one. It's still different, and it plays a lot more silly. There's a lot more comedy in it, stuff like that. But the first one's really what just hits the marks for me. Again, another unrated film that was pushing the boundaries. They kind of had to do a lot to get this movie out, and I appreciate that. Again, as a filmmaker, it's not always the movie itself that makes it my favorite. There's a lot of other elements. Again, as somebody who enjoys filmmaking, I look at it from that perspective as well, so it might just be the way it was filmed, the way it was put together, the work that was put into it. I love the whole story of The Evil Dead. I love the way that these guys raised money, were able to make this film independently, put it all together. And it was very creative as well. This whole first-person point of view with the demon in the woods and stuff like that wasn't a common thing, and now it is. It really led the way for that perspective. It was very original for the time. And while there is comedic moments in this, not intentionally, I wouldn't say, it was treated as a more serious horror movie, and it still has some shocking moments. I think that tree scene still gets people, and I know it's one that Sam Raimi said he kind of wishes he hadn't put in the movie, again, for shock value. It's not really necessary, but it definitely adds a little extra punch to the movie, so I have no issues with it. I think it suits. This movie's just great, and again, ends on a depressing note. Nobody survives. Sorry, spoiler. Again, of course, they managed to work that into the second movie and change it, but ultimately, at the end of the first movie, everyone's done for. And again, I love those endings. Nobody is safe. And I just love Bruce Campbell as an actor. I like a lot of his stuff. So, of course, over the years, I followed him. There was always hopes for more Evil Dead movies, which eventually we got Ash vs. Evil Dead, which is fantastic. Sad that it ended when it did, but I was happy that we got more from him. And now he's retired the character. So clearly we're done with that. And I'm not going to get into it because I don't want to waste more time here, but I'm not a fan of the remake or Evil Dead Rise. For me, it's the Sam Raimi entries that really do it for me. I did like Ash vs. Evil Dead, which of course Sam only directed the first episode of, but the spirit of it and the fact that Bruce was in it was enough to keep me, interested, and it really did push some limits, so it had a lot of fun. Whereas the future ones feel like more like fan service and feels like it's just doing what's already been done before. What really takes me in about the Evil Dead movies is the originality of them. They're very unique movies doing their own thing, and each one's different from the other, which is great. It keeps things interesting, whereas now it just seems like everybody wants to copy what's already been done. I already have those movies. I don't need yours. But anyways, yes, The Evil Dead is what I consider to be my all-time favorite movie. Not because it's the best movie. It's just the way it was made, the way it all came together, the way it plays out, the fact it was an unrated film that got put in theaters. It got lucky because it got some kind words by Stephen King back in the day, which kind of helped propel it. So just its whole journey over the years and seeing what it became, just fantastic. I love all the elements of it. So it's not just about what's the better movie. I mean, a lot of these movies are pretty cheaply made. They're not definitely Hollywood movies by any means, but I don't care about Hollywood movies. There's lots of great Hollywood movies as well. For me, it's about the creativity behind it, the fun factor. So yeah, that's my top 10. If you enjoyed these movies, let me know down below. What are your favorite movies? What's your top 10? What's your top 5? I know maybe asking for a top 10 is a bit much, but I'd love to hear from you. Tell me what you think about my list. Maybe you won't be interested in my future reviews based off of these ones. And trust me, there are so many other movies that I absolutely love that I didn't add in this list, but I just don't have the time for. But this gives you kind of an insight to what I'm into, what I enjoy the most. So hopefully we'll see you in the first review that I do. Thank you so much for tuning in. I appreciate it. Of course, don't forget to check out some links down below. You can follow me on all the major platforms. If you have a moment, please subscribe. Everything helps the channel grow. I would definitely appreciate it. I hope you all have a fantastic day. Stay sick, everybody. Cheers.